Hi, my name is Marc Crawley and welcome to Diversita Connect. Today we're going to talk about RSD. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that acronym means in a second. But most of the video is going to be how it can affect neurodivergent individuals. RSD is a subject that's only really started to be spoken about sort of quite broadly, maybe in the last couple of years. It certainly wasn't something that I used to see a lot about when we launched Diversita back in 2022. But it's also something that I think is quite misunderstood. And even at Diversita, we're learning about it all the time, and we learn from our community and other areas. So today we're just going to cover it in a little bit of depth, but talking honestly, it is more of an overview today. So let's start really with what is RSD. So the actual name is Rejection Sensitive Dysphoria, and it's often described as an intense, overwhelming pain triggered by being rejected, criticized, not meeting sort of perceived expectations. But it's important to know that in the UK, it's not classed as a formal diagnosis or a neurotype, but it's widely recognized by affecting neurodivergent communities, and particularly one of the core traits of ADHD and autism. But we'll cover that a little bit more in a second. A little bit of an explanation about the background. Dysphoria is derived from the Greek word meaning hard to bear. It isn't just hurt feelings, it's a physical and emotional agony, which is quite interesting. I didn't actually know that before I started doing a little bit more research before this webinar. Obviously, it can be sparked by a literal rejection, and often is, as in you're getting a firm no on something, and obviously there's a build up to that no and to that rejection, which can really cause an emotional response, and the reaction, it can often result in a low mood and social withdrawal or people pleasing, or essentially a lot of masking and obviously covering up the actual feeling if at all possible in that instance. But again, we've got the next slide. We'll cover a little bit more of an overview and give some context around this. So I think it's important at this stage to know that this is not just someone being a little bit disappointed, right? This is a very individual, very uncontrollable in a lot of instances reaction to rejection. So again, and it's one of those areas that when I start looking at statistics like 71% of autistic adults being unemployed, that's never going to be for one single reason, but one of the things that you could see impacting it is something like a real uncontrollable reaction to rejection, which then knocks someone off their feet for a period of time, which means they're not obviously then trying to look for opportunities, and will of course potentially stop looking for opportunities because of the fear of rejection. And similar with ADHD and other neurotypes, it's estimated around 30 to 40% of neurodivergent individuals are unemployed in the UK, and again, that's not for any one reason, but this could be a really, really big contributing factor. So we'll look at this table here. Will maybe show and give a little bit more context. I've just realized that my picture is covering the bottom right hand side, but I'll walk you through what that box says. But ultimately, look, if we're looking at sort of the feature here is the usual reaction for moderate sadness or annoyance would be sort of, I suppose it would be, we're going to be a little bit sad around being rejected, and the intensity for most people is bit annoyed, bit niggly, etc. For RSD, it's excruciating, visceral, physical pain, right? It really can be where someone is literally in an uncontrolled emotional state where they can't sort of push forward, and that can really, really affect people. So rejection and the intensity of rejection is very, very different from what we consider a usual reaction. It's worth noting at this point, before we go over the other areas, it can be very individual and different levels of intensity, duration, recovery, and control. But this is, I suppose, quite a broad stroke approach to give some people context about what RSD can be. So for rejection, the duration for most people will fade over hours and days. And myself, I don't think I don't get affected by RSD, but then like anyone else, I can get disappointed with things and get a little bit sort of cheesed off or annoyed. But talking honestly, the recovery period is nothing like it would be with an RSD. And of course, what's interesting about RSD, based on quite a lot of studies, is that it's one of those areas that can hit very instantly, be almost like that intense sick feeling in your stomach, a physical, almost total body reaction that can certainly last hours, days, or even weeks. Now, again, based around some of the research we've done, it doesn't feel maybe as intense for that entire period, but certainly for a longer period than it would be for most people. So the duration can be a sort of a little bit. So the duration can be very different, but can vary from individual from how intense that emotional and intense that physical reaction can be. Again, with recovery and moving forward, again, for a lot of people, logic helps. It wasn't meant to be. Some reassuring comments from parents and friends and colleagues, etc. And of course, with RSD, logic often fails to soothe the initial sort of emotional flash flood. We talked about this hitting instantly, and again, that seems to be something that really is quite a key component of RSD. About it hits very quickly. It's an emotional flash flood, and talking honestly, there's very little that most people will be able to say to someone who's experiencing that to try to soothe it or to help that recovery. It's one of those areas that often needs to sort of run its course. We'll look a little bit more maybe in part 2 about some techniques to try to help with RSD, but honestly, it looks like on the most part it's one of those areas that just needs to run through. Of course, people will start to have their own tools and their own areas, and particularly, as we mentioned already, is very, very individual. But yeah, the recovery is very, very different. And of course, the control, right? For a lot of people, emotional regulation is possible, even with intense disappointment. But with RSD, it does feel like an involuntary neurological response. It's something that people have very little control over. And of course, if you've seen already, for the duration and the recovery, it can be for an elongated period of time. And I think this is really important here to understand why, particularly when we're talking about applying for jobs, and I'll paint a picture here. If someone applies for a role and they don't get the job, and then they are impacted by RSD because of that, then you'd imagine there's definitely anxiety and a fear factor about putting themselves in that position again. And like I said already, it's never going to be one thing when you have such a large amount of people unemployed. So we'll look a little bit more at some solutions and techniques, as I say, on the other webinar. But today, this is really to paint a picture of that. If you do struggle with RSD, it's definitely a good idea to be very kind to yourself, right? And if so, you can show this video to other people around you, where hopefully they'll start to understand, obviously, the impact of this as well. So this is how it can affect neurodivergent individuals. I suppose the obvious question is, why does it affect neurodivergent individuals, and are particular neurotypes affected? Most people can experience sensitivity rejection. RSD is closely linked, based on studies, to interest-based nervous systems, things like ADHD, autism, etc. So, and it's considered a near universal experience for ADHDers. Unfortunately, it doesn't affect me, but again, I do talk to a lot of people that have this some level of intense emotional reaction to criticism or rejection. Again, with autism, autistic individuals often experience RSD due to social masking, fatigue, and the trauma of being misunderstood. Again, it's that fear factor of putting yourself in the position again, particularly if you have a situation where you do get rejected. be it rejected socially or rejected literally for a role or a promotion or something like that. A lot of autistic individuals will then try to avoid that situation going forward and mask their disappointment, etc. But be under no illusion that it's often there. And then RSD is often exasperated, sorry, pardon my lack of grammar there, when neurotypical society obviously expects individuals to communicate in ways that are natural to them, leading to these micro rejections, etc. So the double empathy factor is important. So how can it affect life, right, on a day-to-day basis, and why does it affect certain sort of day-to-day interactions? Like, most neurodivergent individuals, particularly ADHDers, are people pleasers, and again, constant scanning of looking for acceptance or reassurance, etc. When you don't get that, it can impact RSD. The non-starter, we talked about that already, because to avoid the possibility of failure and thus rejection, it may stop people trying new things or applying for promotions or stretching themselves. And that's often mistaken for laziness or lack of ambition, but it isn't. It's that intense fear of rejection. It really, really is. Some people will go into social withdrawal because it's like, well, I can't put myself through that position again. I can't have that reaction again. I'd rather just avoid those situations going forward. And of course, emotional volatility in the UK workplace, this can be mislabeled as unprofessionalism when it's actually a neurological response to perceived exclusion. So some people get criticized for being overly emotional when they get bad news. But the fact is that I'd say it's pretty consistent with the fact that if you are ADHD, it's a fair chance that you are going to be affected by RSD. So it all comes back to really having the opportunity to have a psychological safe environment where you can disclose your ADHD, and then your manager understand a little bit more about how to communicate news and conversations, etc. But ultimately, it can affect life on a day-to-day basis, and there's a few reasons there. I'm sure there's a load more, and I'd love to hear people's individual sort of experience of RSD, but there's no doubt that it is something that is, I think, a high contributing factor to things like social exclusion and not starting and not applying for roles, etc. So I just wanted to touch on the recruitment part and some of the things where recruitment can maybe do a slightly better job. And I don't know whether our community would agree on this, but it can often be a perfect storm for RSD triggers. Employers following the Equality Act should consider the impacts. Ghosting, right? And if you don't hear from us, you've been unsuccessful. People can build a picture of what's happening. They can build a picture of rejection. They can build a picture that they are ultimately not wanted, and that can obviously then cause some of the reactions that we saw earlier. Vague feedback again makes people fill in the gaps themselves rather than being specific. Now, while it's a difficult balance to strike, right? But ultimately, giving someone bad news in a very, very constructive way I would say, is probably a better solution than vague feedback. I'm not saying initially there won't be a similar reaction, but ultimately you can only be truthful at certain points. If someone fundamentally doesn't have the skills for the job and you can communicate that in an articulate way, for example, then that's fine, right? But it's more a case of, well, just didn't get that, that je ne sais quoi, just didn't get that feeling. That is always going to cause problems. The high stakes interview, and again, the sort of almost the bigger they are, the harder they fall, can be really challenging for neurodivergent individuals, and particularly ADHDers, when a brain perceives the panel or the process as a threat, and then that can cause an emotional, intense reaction. And then from that point onwards, particularly if you don't get the job, there's a lot of self-blaming, there's a lot of reactions around that. So again, it's one of those areas that I think needs to maybe be looked at about the way we interview and qualify people's skills. So there's a few solutions, right? But they're not exhaustive. But things like questions in advance can give people a lot more reassurance around what's going to happen. Every candidate receives a clear yes or no within a set timeline, so you can start to manage your expectations either way as someone who maybe struggles with RSD, because it's almost like trying to give yourself a scenario where, look, if it's a no, I'm going to be disappointed, but you can start to almost get to that period subtly, when then you have almost a nice surprise when you do get the yes. Sometimes it's a process. It can be. I'm not saying it's the right one for everyone, etc., but a lot of individuals may go through that process where they almost want to like think about, okay, if this doesn't happen, this is how it's going to make me feel, and starting to sort of almost manage their response prior to even getting a decision. And of course, organizations focusing on literal logical skills rather than personality. Again, you've seen that logic doesn't necessarily negate all of the feelings from RSD, but it can maybe help a little bit and shorten that recovery period as well. So the recruitment process, I think, is one of those areas that needs a bit of work. And we're starting to talk to organizations about having a really sound, robust, personalized rejection management process in place for people that have interviewed. It's very, very difficult to be able to give specific feedback to thousands of applicants for a job. But if you've had an interview and you haven't got that job, then it should definitely be a personalized rejection management process, which again, hopefully will help with that recovery period. So hopefully this has given a good overview today. So what next? Obviously, we'll add this webinar to the collection where you can comment or ask questions. But I'd love to know if you have some experience with RSD. We've had a few comments already prior to the webinar going out, which was great. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Obviously, we don't have all the answers at Diversita, right? So we'd love to hear anything that you feel that we could have communicated better on this, or anything maybe we need to add on a follow-up webinar. But we, as I say, we did the idea today to give people a bit of an overview about what RSD is. And of course, you can DM us as a ways to have a chat with us. So look, thank you very much for watching today. We hope it's been useful. It's a subject that we're learning about more all the time. And I've attended a lot of different webinars and read quite a lot around this now. But it is something that's starting to get a little bit of momentum, and it does sometimes explain a lot about why we have so many people unemployed, right? And why we have so many people sort of going through social withdrawal, etc. It can be a really big contributing factor. So thank you so much for watching today. Can't wait to see you on the next webinar. But any questions, reach out and let us know. Thanks for today. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And scan the QR code to join the Diversita Connect community.